This is the Wednesday, April 14th, 2021 afternoon session of the Portland City Council. Good afternoon, Keelan. Could you please call the roll?
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Ryan.
Here.
Hardesty. Maps.
Here.
Rubio.
Here.
Wheeler.
Here. Under Portland City Code and state law, the City Council is holding this meeting electronically. All members of the council are attending remotely by video and teleconference. And the city has made several avenues available for the public to listen to the audio broadcast of this meeting. The meeting is available to the public on the city's YouTube channel, eGovPDX, www.portlandoregon.gov/video, and channel 30. The public can also provide written testimony to the council by emailing the council clerk at cctestimony@portlandoregon.gov. The council is taking these steps as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to limit in-person contact and to promote physical distancing. The pandemic is an emergency that threatens the public health, safety, and welfare, which requires us to meet remotely by electronic communications. As always, thank you for your patience, your flexibility, and your understanding as we manage through these challenges to conduct the city's business. And with that, we'll hear from legal counsel on the rules of order and decorum. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. To participate in council meetings, you may sign up in advance with the council clerk's office for communications to briefly speak about any subject. You may also sign up for public testimony on resolutions or first readings of ordinances. The published council agenda at portlandoregon.gov/auditor contains information about how and when you may sign up for testimony while the city council is holding electronic meetings. Your testimony should address the matter being considered at the time. When testifying, please state your name for the record. Your address is not necessary. Please disclose if you're a lobbyist. If you're representing an organization, please identify it. The presiding officer determines the length of testimony. Individuals generally have 3 minutes to testify unless otherwise stated. When your time is up, the presiding officer will ask you to conclude. Disruptive conduct, such as shouting, refusing to conclude your testimony when your time is up, or interrupting others' testimony or council deliberations will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning will be given that further disruption may result in the person being placed on hold or ejected for the remainder of the electronic meeting. Please be aware that all council meetings are recorded.
Thank you very much. We have 2 items today. Keelan, can you please read items 250 and 251 together?
Item 250, amend Title 33 Planning and Zoning to facilitate the provision of shelter and housing options for Portlanders in need. Item 251, amend City Code Health and Sanitation, Emergency Code, Public Improvements, Water, Property Maintenance Regulations, and Affordable Housing to facilitate the provision of shelter and housing options for Portlanders in need.
Thank you. Colleagues, over the course of the last month, we've been working our way through the shelter to housing continuum, hearing public testimony and moving and voting on certain amendments. Today, we will turn to the remaining items in question before voting on the entire package, which will happen at a later date. Before diving in, I'd like to ask Bureau staff to provide us with a brief summary of where we are and what written testimony has come in since our last meeting. And so with that, I'll introduce Eric Engstrom and Andrea Urban.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon for the record. My name is Andrea Urban. I'm the Director for Planning and Sustainability. We are here today to continue your deliberations around the shelter to housing continuum and focus in on 2 items. I'll start with a recap of where we're at in the process. On March 17th, you had a first hearing. Thank you all for staying late and hearing from everyone. We know that you have a lot of on your plate right now. On March 24th, you deliberated and identified several amendments. On March 31st, you moved and voted on several amendments, notably clarifying the open space and parks issues. At the end of that session, you asked that we reopen the record and hear today about 2 elements that were not as visible given all the discussion about parks, specifically tiny homes on wheels and a proposal to allow shelter at institutional sites. You will hear testimony today about those 2 specific items. After testimony, staff can answer any of your questions. If we're able to resolve your remaining questions today, we will return on April 28th for a final vote. And now Eric Engstrom will give a brief overview of the testimony received over the past few weeks and orient you further on these 2 topics. Eric.
Thank you, Andrea. I will start by just going over the written testimony you received, and then I can show a brief PowerPoint orienting you to the topics. The last time you met, you voted on a number of amendments, and I will say that the volume of written testimony has dropped off considerably since you voted on the open space issue last time. But we did get on the order of around 40 different written letters since you met last. About half of that was testimony in favor of the Portland Neighbors Welcome Amendment that you'll be discussing today. Excuse me. There were only a few letters related to RVs and tiny homes, some in favor and a few against. There were a few letters concerned about open space still, and the remainder of the testimony was just more general support or opposition letters to the entire package. But again, most of the testimony in the written form came in was about the Portland Neighbors Welcome Amendments and support for those. So I will attempt to share my screen here with the PowerPoint. Okay, and can you all see that now?
Yeah, we see it.
Great. So just a reminder that there were 4 areas to the entire package. The first section was about facilitating shelters, the second about the new type of outdoor shelter, the third about group living, and then the fourth about the occupancy of RVs and tiny houses on wheels. As was mentioned, the business for today covers 2 remaining topics that you didn't cover in the last meeting. The first is consideration of an amendment related to allowing shelters on institutional sites in single dwelling zones. And that was referred to as item 2.2 on the March 31st staff memo. And by the way, that memo is the memo I'll be referring to as we go through this. It has the actual code language for these pieces. And there's a link to that posted on the council agenda if you don't have it in front of you. The second item for today is to discuss the tiny houses on wheels and RVs section, which was referenced as item 3.1 in the memo. So to cover the first item, again, this is about shelters on institutional sites in single dwelling zones. Overall, as you recall, the intent of the package related to shelters was to expand where shelters are allowed without conditional use and increase the number of beds allowed in a number of different zones. And you've seen this slide before, but this is just a reminder of that this is the current distribution of shelters. I'm not going to ask you to read through this, but this is for reference in case we need it later. It's a summary of how the different shelter types are allowed in the different zoning designations. And mostly this amendment deals with single dwelling zones, which in the current proposal is always a conditional use. This is a map that shows the mass shelter allowances in single dwelling zones, the yellow being conditional use. This is the outdoor shelter allowances. Again, you've seen these. So Amendment 2.2, it's similar to an approach you took, the council took last year in 2020 for affordable housing. And you may remember the Expanding Opportunities for Affordable Housing project amended the code to allow institutional uses to add affordable housing regulated affordable housing units to their sites without conditional use. And this takes a similar approach with shelters. So it would allow religious institutions and other similar institutional uses in single dwelling zones, except for park and open areas. I want to make sure that's clear, to host small shelters up to 20 beds or pods without a conditional use review. And I just say pods because with the outdoor shelters, it could be a variety of different forms that takes. So institutional uses, again, most of the institutional uses in single dwelling zones are religious or faith-based institutions, but there are a few schools in there, small colleges, some nonprofit service providers, fire stations are included in that category, as are a few other uses, but overwhelmingly most of these kind of uses are faith-based institutions. There are about 1,300 sites that would qualify citywide under this amendment, with an average site of about an acre. So that's a very quick overview of the First Amendment. The second topic, RVs and tiny houses on wheels. I will briefly go through that. There's not an amendment on the table at this point about this, but I think the hearing today was designed to give that a little more light. So tiny houses and RVs are vehicles under state law, not buildings. So that means they're treated a little bit differently in city code. And I want to also make it clear that the primary code we're amending here with this item is Title 29, not Title 33, although there are a few zoning amendments necessary to make this work cleanly, but this is mostly not a land use action, but it's about clarifying our property maintenance and nuisance codes. BDS is temporarily not enforcing a ban on permanent residential occupancy of tiny houses on wheels or RVs pending a future policy decision. This is just a screenshot of a handout that they currently have in the permit center about that. I'm not expecting you to read it, but I just wanted you to know they have a handout and there are guidelines that are informally in place, but not codified. So there are a few other places where we allow tiny houses on wheels and RVs in Portland. Campgrounds are commercial use. So there are a few commercial hotels that utilize tiny houses on wheels, and that's sort of a different thing than what we're talking about today. We also allow them in RV parks, which is also a commercial use. There are a few such things in Portland, but not many. Of course, tiny houses without wheels are just houses, and we don't, this is not about that. It's not about the tininess. It's really about the specific provision for the occupancy of what essentially is a vehicle. Also want to make it clear that the amendments you made to shelters to permit outdoor shelters, one of the potential accommodations in an outdoor shelter could be a vehicle or a tiny house on wheels or an RV. That's sort of a separate element of this package. The Title 29 aspect of the package was really about single family and residential occupancy in a residential setting. So the proposal was essentially to allow one occupied tiny house or RV on a residential lot. Again, this is not the right of way. This is a residential lot. And that one caveat was that it would require a campground style utility connection. The zoning code already regulates where you can park RVs and vehicles in a residential setting, and you're not allowed to park an RV in the front yard. So that would still be, we haven't amended that in this provision. So just briefly, the evolution of this topic in the package, it was not part of the initial staff draft in the fall of 2020. We added it based on quite a bit of public testimony we received in the fall to the November draft. The initial proposal included requirements for not only the campground style hookup, but also DMV registration and a certification that it met certain national standards. The final staff recommendation dropped the certification and the DMV element based on further testimony and discussion, but kept the utility requirement. So at this point, I also want to ask BES staff, Elizabeth, to jump in here and just say a few things about the sanitary sewer aspect.
Thanks, Eric. Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners. My name is Elizabeth Reese-Cadigan. I'm the Systems Development Manager with the Bureau of Environmental Services. You may recall that Marie Walkowitz with BES provided a more detailed presentation on the topic of sanitation for RVs and tiny homes to you last month. I'm just going to briefly revisit and clarify a few of the items that Marie covered. As Eric said, the current proposal will allow one RV or tiny home to be permanently occupied on a residential property. And the proposal requires that RVs and tiny homes must have utility service, which includes water, electricity, and sewer. So tiny homes and RVs without plumbing will function like a detached bedroom, and access to sanitation will be provided by the hosting home. RVs and tiny homes with plumbing will function like an independent home and must be connected to the sanitary system by a campground-style dump station. Alternative methods of sanitation, such as composting toilets, can be reviewed by Bureau of Development Services through appeal, which is consistent with the current process. Next slide, please. As a reminder, the hosting home will be responsible for ensuring that the RV or tiny home is connected to utility services. Through this shelter to housing continuum process, BES and BDS have worked together to clarify the relevant fees and to try to keep permitting costs low, understanding that some homeowners who choose to host an RV or tiny home may have limited financial means. Not only does this increase housing options for folks at risk of being houseless, but keeping costs as affordable as possible also reduces the likelihood that folks will discharge sewage in a manner that poses a threat to public health. Sanitary service for the RV or tiny home would be through, as Eric said, a campground style dump station connection to the existing sewer line serving the hosting home. No new connection to the public sewer is expected. The plumbing permit for this work can be processed quickly. The cost for that permit is $143 currently. Total costs for all of the utility permits is $451. No system development charges will be applied. We're also sensitive to the private costs of making a connection. Using a campground style dump station connected to the existing sanitary line on the property is the lowest cost way to connect to the sewer. On many sites, the connection can be made easily and costs will be relatively low. On some sites, the slope of the site or the location of the sanitary line in relation to the RV or tiny home location or other factors will make it more complex and costly to make the needed connections. And to support people in situations who may not have the financial means to pay the private plumbing costs out of pocket, BES will be expanding 2 of our loan programs to make them available for people wanting to host an occupied RV or tiny home on their property. We have a safety net loan program, which serves income qualified individuals. It has a 1.5% interest rate. We also have a standard private plumbing loan program, which currently has a 6% interest rate. A significant benefit of being connected to the public sewer system is that there are no ongoing costs for dumping waste from an RV holding tank, either at a public facility or through a mobile service. And with that, I'll turn it back to Eric, and I will be happy to take any questions at the conclusion of the presentation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. The last thing, there's 2 more things I wanted to cover before I conclude. One is it's come up a few times, sort of what happens after this passes. And this element, by the way, would go into effect as the ordinance is currently written on August 1st. So I'd like to ask Beth Benton from BDS to just say a few words about how they approach the compliance once something like this goes into effect.
Good afternoon. I'm Beth Benton, Property Compliance Division Manager with BDS. What we are anticipating is using the time between now and August 1st to update our webpage, create brochures, and work on education for the community. And then after that, for a period of months, we're looking at probably 6 months, possibly 12, to do a grace period where if we get any complaints for existing structures that were already in place, to work with those property owners so that they can have time to make the necessary compliance requirements. And that would also hold off on any liens.
Thanks, Beth. The one additional topic I wanted to cover is ask Jesse Connor of the Housing Bureau to just say a few words about how this topic relates to the landlord-tenant rules.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Council. Jessica Connor, I'm the Senior Policy and Planning Coordinator at the Portland Housing Bureau. So the Shelter to Housing Continuum Project is really taking Portland into some new policy spaces. And with those new policy spaces are new policy intersections. One of those intersections is around some of the alternative housing types that have been considered and are currently under discussion in the landlord-tenant space. So we wanted to just daylight this policy intersection today. And while there is a lack of specificity in local and state landlord-tenant laws, they were written without these new housing types in mind. There are strong indicators that these laws would apply under certain situations. It's likely that these housing arrangements will be entered to informally and potentially without the parties having a full understanding of the rules, regulations, and protections that may apply to them. So we just wanted to take that moment today to highlight this policy intersection for the council and for the public that have joined us. Thanks. Back to you, Eric.
Thanks, Jesse. And I will stop sharing and then ask council if there are any clarifying questions before we move on.
Colleagues, any questions to start? I've got two that'll help prompt the discussion. First of all, thank you for the concise presentation. I appreciated it. There was some testimony relating to composting toilets with the tiny houses and the tiny houses on wheels. I understand that was looked at. Could you tell us what you concluded with that?
Sure. It's my understanding that BDS has the discretion with the proposed code. They have the discretion to grant an exception through the appeals process to permit alternate means of compliance. So they could potentially approve a composting toilet through an appeals process, which is similar to what they would do now.
Okay, thank you. And I just wanted a clarification on something you said. I think I heard you say that the obligation for sanitation is the host's obligation, and they really have two major choices, if I heard you correctly. Choice number one is that they could provide that, what you described as a campsite hookup to the lateral. Alternatively, I think I heard you say, or they could simply make available their sanitation in their house. Is that correct?
The second option you listed is available if the vehicle they're hosting doesn't have internal plumbing. If they're going to host a vehicle that has plumbing inside it and we're supplying it with water, then we'd ask that there be that connection.
All right, good. And then somebody had mentioned during testimony, and it jogged my memory when I saw the photograph you were using on your presentation there, that the tiny houses on wheels by definition are pretty tall. And so they are tall enough to look over fences and things like that. And I sense that could create some consternation on the part of neighbors. Has there been any thought given to that?
It was a topic that was discussed. In the end, the Planning Commission's recommendation was to keep this as flexible as possible. There are not currently building setbacks that are applied to vehicles, although there are rules about where driveways can be and things like that. And as I mentioned before, you can't park an RV under current rules in the front yard. But there is the possibility that the vehicle would be close to a property line, like on the side of a driveway or something, and that is not currently, that's not addressed in the proposal because we wanted to keep the flexibility. And again, the current zoning allows those vehicles to be there. It's just the occupancy that we're changing.
So are we relying then somewhat on neighbors being in touch with neighbors, that sort of thing? Is there any notification requirement, or is this really just a question of goodwill between neighbors?
There is not currently a notification requirement.
Very good. And then my final question, can you review for me just briefly the rules on Airbnb? I think part of our hope here is that these units would be offered up as lower cost housing alternatives for people who are currently in the city who are housing insecure. But obviously there's a private market out there for short-term rentals. Can you tell me a little bit how this intersects with that?
Sure. The proposed rules in the zoning code that we've written with this package would preclude one from using the tiny house on wheels or RV in this setting as a short-term rental. You would still be able to do short-term rental of RVs and tiny houses as a commercial hotel, but that's a commercial use in a commercial zone.
Thank you very much. And short-term, again, can you remind me, short-term is defined as how long?
Less than 30 days.
Less than 30 days. Thank you. That concludes my questions. And when we're done hearing from other council members, if they have questions right now, since you mentioned the Planning and Sustainability Commission, we do have some invited testimony that that we'll hear in a moment. But first, I want to ask my colleagues if they have any questions based on the presentations we've heard so far.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I have a quick question, if I may. I think this one goes to Jessica, I believe, who talked about how these new rules might change the relationship between homeowners and the folks who are hosting an RV or tiny house. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that some. I think what I heard you say is that given the space we're moving into, it might be helpful to think of hosting a tiny house in your backyard as sort of a landlord-tenant type situation, which maybe it's been more informal in the past. And I was just wondering if you have any advice for people who are in that situation. What are the best practices if you're hosting a RV, in your backyard or a tiny house? Should you pursue a formal lease or something? How do people protect themselves and just navigate this space?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Commissioner Matz, for the question. So I think first off, since it is a new space, I think some of the best practices we haven't developed, but generally speaking, particularly because this relationship hasn't existed, right? Either exchange of funds for renting or perhaps some groundskeeping work. I think generally though, some type of lease or document that is sort of describing the rights and responsibilities for each party are important. I think that some of the information that the Rental Services Office has at the Housing Bureau has some good pamphlets and some descriptions about kind of what the responsibilities there are. But in general, I think that we could see there will be a need for someone wanting to step into this space to educate themselves around, as the landlord, what is it that I need to be doing and responsible for? And then what can I expect from the individual or the household that it may be renting from me?
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Seeing no questions at this particular moment, before we get into public testimony, we have some invited testimony, just a couple of folks. First of all, Eli Spivak, who's the chair of the Planning and Sustainability Commission. He's here to share a short statement about PSC's recommendations. Eli, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler and City Council for including me in this discussion. While the amendment on the shelter beds in institutional sites and single dwelling zones seems consistent with the PSC's direction on the project, we didn't deliberate on that specifically, so I'm not going to speak on that one in front of you today. But we and you did receive significant amounts of testimony on legalizing tiny homes and RVs for occupancy, sprinkled among even more testimony on our open spaces. And you're about to hear more. So I thought I'd provide a quick refresher on the PSC's recommendations on this issue. But first, the status quo. In 2017, in response to advocacy from the Lebanon community and others, Portland halted enforcement of the property maintenance code ban on sleeping in vehicles on private property, so long as standards are met. And Eric shared the city's posting on those informal rules that have served as a temporary measure. This non-enforcement practice is at the discretion of the commissioner in charge of BDS, which has changed 2 times at least in the ensuing years. Any BDS commissioner, current or future, has sole discretion to continue this decision or reverse it at any time. So although the enforcement pause has been welcome for people living in tiny homes and RVs, their status is still clearly tenuous and insecure. Also, it creates a disincentive for property owners to invest in things like sewer connections or electrical service extensions because no one knows if what's allowed today will be allowed tomorrow. Should the policy be reversed, we fear that some of these tiny homes might end up spilling out into the right-of-way with water lines and extension cords going over the sidewalk. We learned from testimony that in the Coley neighborhood, there may be as many occupied tiny homes and RVs as there are ADUs. It's not an insubstantial trend. And it's running largely below the radar screen. Yet this kind of housing is providing an important role in meeting the shelter needs of Portland's least affluent residents, all on private property and with no public funding. The PSC's recommendation is to adopt code that would allow the occupation of tiny homes and RVs with rules that would be somewhat stricter than what's being allowed today. So the recommendation is to allow one tiny home or RV per lot, and only such lots that have a house, attached house, or manufactured home, whereas current guidelines allowed on single-family properties, including with duplexes. We would ensure that if it's got plumbing, it must be connected to sewer, as we discussed, where the current guidelines are more informal. And we recognize that some of these less formal practices raise concerns at BES. And as Eric mentioned, we would not allow them to be used as short-term rentals. We recommend the City Council at a minimum support these code changes. And in our letter to Council, we suggested considering a couple other things as well. One of them is to allow an alternative approach to sewer. And it sounds like BES is already constructively engaged on this issue, which is great to hear. We suggested that you might consider expanding the availability to lots with middle housing. So for example, allow them in a lot where there's a duplex. Right now in our single dwelling zones, there's a wide variety of non-single items. And potentially to allow more than one occupied vehicle on a residential lot, presumably accompanied by stricter standards and/or a conditional use process. There are some longstanding, effective, and safe tiny house pods in Portland under the radar screen, and they can serve as a bridge housing use on a site where more permanent housing and density is expected down the road. But we definitely wouldn't want to have a situation where someone puts 6 rundown RVs on a lot to rent them out. It would be important that if you go more than one, it be strictly done. If you hear compelling testimony in line with these changes, we encourage you to craft amendments in support. In response to the housing crisis, tiny homes and RVs have become a discreet, dispersed, and safe way for private individuals to provide inexpensive housing in a city with too few choices, and where far too many of our neighbors have no shelter at all, and where public resources, meaning funds and property, are overstretched. Please support the PSC's unanimous recommendation to include tiny homes and RVs on private property as part of the suite of policy tools contained within the Shelter to Housing Continuum project. And I'll mention, because you mentioned before about the height of the structure and looking over neighbors, we had a little bit of discussion about that, but the sense is that although there's always a concern of neighbors looking on neighbors' yards, you could have in any of these zones a 2-story house 5 feet from the property line doing the same thing, or you could have a garage or a shed right on the property line up to 10 feet high. So although there is the potential for impact, it doesn't seem to dwarf other situations where neighbors are looking at each other. So I'll stay on to listen to testimony and be available for questions. Thank you so much for consideration on this project.
Thanks, Eli, and thank you for elaborating a little bit more on the height issue. You made a compelling case there, in my opinion. Next, we have Marisa Zapata. She is the Associate Professor of Land Use Planning at Portland State University and the Director of PSU's Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative. Professor Zapata, thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it. Let's see here. Do we have Professor Zapata on? Let me go down the list here. Is she not on? I don't see her. Do you see her? Keelan?
You know what? Is it Marisa Zapata?
Yeah, there.
Okay, I think we just promoted her to a panelist.
Thank you. Okay, good. Marisa, can you hear?
I can hear now. Hi, y'all. Sorry.
No problem.
I was
good to have you. Thanks
not in the club yet. Thank you for having me, and forgive the chaos of my nursery. I want to thank y'all today for having the opportunity to speak to you about tiny homes and wheels. I am Dr. Marisa Zapata, and I'm the director of the Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative at Portland State University, where I'm also a professor of land use planning. My work sits at the intersection of racial equity and planning and policy making. I want to acknowledge that yet again, y'all are meeting and I'm giving remarks in a tumultuous and tragic moment in our country. I think it's noteworthy that this is now a recurring issue, and the last year has been particularly hard. I think it's important to keep that in mind because on one hand, we all have frankly much better things to do than to be talking about tiny homes and wheels and RVs. I think we can be honest about that. It's fun and wonky, but isn't necessarily the issue that is front and center in most of our minds. But I think it is important because there are things that have been raised in the entire component of shelter to housing, and particularly in how tiny homes on wheels and RVs have been put forward and are being considered. As an urban planner, when I'm looking at a plan or policy, I'm looking at a rational basis for any decisions that are being made. I'm looking at a problem definition for how the proposed policies will actually meet their goal. And then most importantly, for trade-off analyses. What are the unintended and intended consequences and what may happen? I found none of that in the BPS analyses when it came to tiny homes on wheels and RVs. They did some analytics, but nothing that really and particularly focused on if this would actually help solve our affordable housing problem. And what happens when we suddenly allow tiny homes on wheels and RVs to be part of a housing supply consideration? I think these are serious questions that warranted real investigation. I'm also really concerned and always looking for who was allowed to have commentary input and who do they represent? So who was at the table and who showed up? As you heard, BPS did not originally have this in their policy, and it suddenly appears under the auspices of, quote, community input. I am deeply questioning who that community was. This is supposed to be a policy that is focused on people experiencing homelessness. From talking to people and what I've observed in social media, the people who have been pushing for this particular issue tend to be housed and middle class. And it doesn't mean that it's a bad idea, but I have serious concerns when we are not applying equity lenses to who is getting to advance policy and ideas. I honestly still am not sure how this ended up in a bill. So I really would like to see a questioning of representation throughout this, including in the people who've written in now. When we think about an equity lens, these are kind of the questions that I would want to see is who actually benefits? Is it people experiencing homelessness? Is it people who are going to be generating and making money off of tiny homes on wheels and RVs? Is it visitors? Is it people who just want more space? Is it the people who will in fact construct and build the tiny homes on wheels and RVs? And then lastly, in what ways does it actually potentially harm people experiencing homelessness? I don't think that any of you imagine a place where we're using all of our money for affordable housing in which everyone is given an RV and we call it done. But at the same time, because we haven't done the analytics around what it means to add RVs and tiny homes on wheels into our housing supply, we are now left open for that. And particularly because of the way that competitive funding applications are put out, allowing this to count as a housing unit opens up the possibility that we will relegate our most vulnerable community members to a lowest quality type of housing. I think that, again, I know that y'all are in a really tough situation. You are trying to both respond to a massive humanitarian crisis while trying to figure out how to rapidly bring online, produce, and acquire and preserve the biggest city infrastructure we could possibly have, which is affordable housing. And I think that we owe it to people experiencing homelessness, to the public, and to yourselves to make sure we're having those conversations in appropriate and different spaces. And so shelter to housing is really about shelter siting and clarifying some specific things about housing. Our next move should be to take things like tiny homes on wheels and RVs and SROs and put them into a larger affordable housing supply conversation where we can carefully consider when, where, how, and in what manner these alternative housing units actually fulfill our goal to support all community members. I thank you for the opportunity to talk. I would love to be in conversation going forward on advancing affordable housing, and we're here to serve y'all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zapata. We appreciate your participation again as well. So colleagues, at this point, I'm going to turn over the gavel to Commissioner Ryan. I am obviously going to remain present, but I also have an unanticipated family obligation that requires me to be in transit. And so I don't think it's fair for me to try and preside over a meeting when I'm also in the car, just in case the connections get funky. So Commissioner Ryan, I will turn the gavel over to you at this point for public testimony.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. And I just want to acknowledge that I had a meeting near City Hall, so here I am in the office, and the technology is a little challenging, so excuse my staging, if you will, for today. We will now hear the public testimony on these two items. Members of the public will have 2 minutes to present. Keelan, who do we have up? Who do we have lined up to testify? And I think you usually do this in increments of 3 and provide it in the chat as well, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I will call the first 3, and it looks like we have about 27 people or so on the line to testify. First up, we have Tim McCormick, Heidi Hart, and Henry Kramer.
And
Hi, can you hear me?
Before we jump in, I just also want people to be aware that the written record remains open until 5 p.m. So if for any reason we get through the public testimony prior to 5 p.m., we'll have to take a recess to actually cast the vote until after 5 p.m., just so my colleagues are aware of that.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, so first up, we have Tim McCormick.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Tim, loud and clear.
Hi. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council members. My name is Tim McCormick from PDX Shelter Forum and Village Collaborative. I'm here to support approval of Shelter to Continuum project. Also support the amendment to allow outdoor shelters or villages on community-based organization sites without requiring conditional use process. I think a lot of people see the logic in that. Second, I'd like to support an amendment allowing a range of ways for tiny houses on wheels and RVs to provide utilities, very much supporting what Eli Spivak said earlier. About mobile dwellings, I would like to note that no amendment has been put on the table, and I really think that appropriate process would be to, are you still hearing me? Can you hear me? Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
I'm looking at the video with a time lag. Sorry, I don't see a clock up, but I'll try to wrap up here. So I think an amendment needs to be put on the table about this, reflecting the very strong public interest, and allow that to be discussed before a vote. And I'm not seeing that happen. So I'd like to propose that happen before it be voted on. Secondly, you know, I wasn't planning this, but in response to Dr. Marisa Zapata's testimony, I'd like to say that in certain ways I very much disagree, and in certain ways I very much share what I believe are her goals. First of all, I would like to say that I have probably been more involved, I think, in shelter to housing continuum than any citizen in the city, other than someone who's on staff. It's been my primary focus in the last year. And I myself am formerly homeless and currently near homeless. And in the last 10 years have not ever been able to have formal housing. So I've been living in, researching in, and deeply focused on this. I also have a book in progress called Village Building, addressing the history and current state of these issues, which I've been working on for the last 2 years. I believe that fears of and efforts to invalidate emerging or alternative housing forms very consistently come from privileged and official viewpoints, whereas marginalized people are typically pioneers, embracers, and the people best served by such new forms. This is a very consistent pattern across countries and eras. And so in that regard, I would disagree with Dr. Zapata. On the other hand, I very much agree that our goal here should be pathways to permanent housing that really serves people. I'd emphasize that the tiny homes is probably the main way S2HC can actually enable more housing and create a pathway that can be upgraded. And finally, I would just like to respond to a request from Mayor Wheeler that after my testimony last week, to share with you a proposal which addresses our vision for this. It's called New Starter Homes. I just submitted it into MapApp. It's also at New Starter Homes, all one word, .housing.wiki, which explores how we can build upon shelter to housing to emphasize permanent housing at a low cost on a wide scale by using cottage cluster accessory dwelling provisions that planning will be working on in the next year. Thank you for your time and for your and staff and community's work on this amazing project.
Thank you, Tim.
Commissioner Ryan, before you move on, Tim, could you give us the link one more time? Is Tim still there? Did anybody get the link?
Yeah, sorry, I just unmuted again.
The link again.
Yes, sure. It's New Starter Homes, all one word, .housing.wiki, which is my effort to make a URL as speakable as possible. But it is also in the map app. And if you Google New Starter Homes, I believe you will get it.
I've got it. I brought it up. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Heidi Hart.
Hi, I'm Heidi Hart. I will be reading testimony from Chris Blackmore, who is not able to attend today. Good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Chris Blackmore, and a few weeks ago, I spoke in support of the formal legalization of occupied tiny houses on wheels and RVs on residential property, as well as my concerns regarding new proposed rules around utilities and the potential for displacement of current residents, including myself. I'm sorry I couldn't be here today, but thank you for taking the time to hear more community feedback on this subject before moving forward. When my husband and I were researching tiny house utilities, we consulted the city's current guidelines to make sure everything was by the book. Portland already requires that gray water not be disposed of on the ground, that sewage is not dumped into storm drains, and that utility lines be adequately protected. Requiring expensive new sewer connections and utility posts now will only serve to make the homes of those of us who have already been doing our best to follow the rules for the last several years non-compliant. That's why I support Portland Neighbors Welcome in their call to codify the city's existing guidelines for occupied tiny homes and RVs. These guidelines actively address the practices we want to avoid as a community, such as illegal dumping, but provide maximum flexibility for those who want to use alternative systems for budget, environmental, and lifestyle reasons. Portland has an exciting opportunity to be a national leader in this area, a city that rises to address the realities of our current housing and environmental challenges instead of adopting a one-size-fits approach. Let's legalize tiny houses and then work with the local community of builders, nonprofits, and residents to create a tiny house program that can be a model for other cities. Create a permitting system for sewer alternatives and generate revenue. Provide educational materials, classes, and workshops. Keep the loan program for sewer connections, but don't require them. These are just a few ideas, but whatever it looks like, let's work together to think boldly and creatively about the next chapter in our city's tiny house story. Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Maps.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryan. I was just I believe some of the issues that Chris raised were addressed by staff. I was wondering if someone from BES could quickly jump in here and remind us what to do if you are in a tiny house and let's say you have a composting toilet and you're unsure how to proceed.
Yeah, thanks for that, Commissioner Maps. And the Terry Whitehill, the building official from BDS, is, I believe, also in the meeting, and so he may be able to answer questions as well. But there is an appeal process that applicants can go through to request an alternative form of sanitation. Terry.
Yeah, this is Terry. There actually is code that allows composting toilets now, residential uses. So that part's pretty easy. The part that becomes gray water, you still have to deal with, and you can't do that with a composting toilet. So you still may need a connection to handle your gray water. But the composting toilet is, I don't see issues with that.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Terry. And thank you, Commissioner Ryan.
Okay, thank you, Heidi, for your testimony. Who's next, Keelan?
Next up, we have Henry Kramer.
Thank you. Mayor Wheeler, commissioners, my name is Henry Kramer. I'm a homeowner and small landlord in Northeast Portland. I strongly support the shelter to housing continuum, although I believe it would be greatly improved by adopting amendments proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome regarding shelters and institutional properties and RVs and tiny houses on wheels and residential properties. I'm going to focus my testimony on the RVs and tiny houses, but I also support allowing faith and community-based organizations to host shelters by right for all the reasons you'll hear. Turning to RVs and tiny houses on wheels and residential property, I urge you to do everything possible to avoid displacing anybody currently living in this arrangement. The city's now longstanding policy allowing these homes is wonderful. I make use of it myself, hosting a tiny house on wheels in my backyard for nearly 2 years. I'm grateful that the shelter to housing draft permanently legalizes these arrangements, but I worry that the new restrictions in the proposed draft will displace tenants. Instead, the city should simply codify the existing BDS guidelines for RVs and tiny houses on residential properties, which manage to provide fair standards while preserving flexibility for diverse budgets and contexts. Their electricity guidelines prioritize safety, and their sanitation directives ensure good hygiene, while neither require tiny house tenants or hosts to break the bank. The one-size-fits-all approach in the draft proposal costs many thousands of dollars and will be prohibitively expensive in some cases. If the draft passes as is, my tenants and I will need to completely overhaul our property, and one or both of us will need to take on significant debt. A city loan program is nice, but it is far from a panacea. $10,000 to $20,000 of new debt would be a huge burden for me, and I would try to shoulder it. But I'm a pro-housing activist who actively organizes to prevent displacement. I'm duty-bound to make it work, despite the likelihood that doing so would likely put me in financial peril. But most current hosts of RVs and tiny houses are not duty-bound pro-housing activists. At least some will balk at these new major costs and risks and simply stop hosting these homes. This would mean avoidable displacement of many people, leading to more RVs in the right-of-way with less stability for these newly homeless people and worse sanitation and safety for the entire community. If you go the route of a waiver, which seems like an intriguing idea, please make sure that those are free of charge to the applicant. Conditional use can be extremely expensive. And if we replace one giant cost with a different giant cost, it won't work. So we need to make sure that if there's going to be a waiver, it needs to be cost neutral. To recap, please pass shelter to housing with the amendments proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome, and thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you. Commissioner Max.
Yes, I want to thank Henry for that testimony. I also would like to get some clarification from staff. As far as I can tell, we're not making any changes in the official rules surrounding RVs and tiny houses. Is that correct, or am I missing something?
Commissioner Maps, I can address that. The current guidelines do not specifically require the utility hookup, so that is the one change. Although keep in mind the current guidelines have never been adopted by anyone, and so there's, as some of the testimony earlier indicated, they could be changed at any moment at the discretion of the Bureau of Development Services. I think what's happening here is as we're making rules for more permanent regulations, we're trying to better address the concerns around sanitation and the risks of sewage spills from that.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Henry.
Next up, we have Tricia Patterson, David Sweet, and Johan Hannesen.
Hi there. Hello, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Tricia Patterson on behalf of Portland Neighbors Welcome. Thank you for taking testimony on these amendments. Our hope is that this council will hear the calls of the community to keep our housing options flexible and ensure that nobody is displaced by this policy. Our shared goal is to get people off the street and into safe and stable housing. These two amendments can help facilitate that goal. First, we wholeheartedly support the amendment to allow churches, faith-based organizations, and community organizations to host up to 20 individual shelters by right on their properties. We echo the sentiments that are going to be expressed by the Interfaith Alliance in support of this amendment. We look to churches, faith groups, and community groups for moral clarity on how to address many social issues, and lowering the barrier for these groups to house those in need is a critical piece to solving our homelessness crisis. Second, we urge this council to legalize tiny homes and RVs on private residential lots. Homeowners should be able to host a tiny home on their property with ease and provide a safe place for somebody to live. We ask that this council shift from the narrow rule in the proposed draft and instead codify the existing rules from the Bureau of Development Services regarding RVs and tiny home sanitation and electricity. These guidelines allow RVs and tiny homes multiple options for sanitation and electricity without mandating a sewer hookup that can cost upwards of $10,000 to $20,000. These guidelines recognize that many options are available to us now, like waste pumping, gray water dilution, hermetic sealing, a bunch of options, which cost a fraction of what is proposed. Well, we do appreciate the Water Bureau's proposal of a loan program to provide upfront payments for sewer hookups. We hope that homeowners use it, but we shouldn't delude ourselves into believing that this proposal resolves our displacement concerns. These are very real concerns. And asking homeowners to take on new debt or shouldering the cost of an appeals process, it all but guarantees some people who are safely housed will be displaced. There is a better way. Codify the existing guidelines from BDS. Please don't adopt rules that will remove flexibility and add new large costs to existing RVs and tiny homes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Tricia.
Next up, we have David Sweet.
Good afternoon, Council. My name is David Sweet, and for about 2 months of every year, I live in a tiny house on wheels. The rest of the year, I live in a duplex in the Cully neighborhood. Many of my Cully neighbors live in tiny houses year-round, not like me, so they can spend part of the winter in the national parks of southern Arizona, spring or fall in Utah, eastern Oregon. Tiny houses are a clever response to the high cost of housing. Importantly for all of us, they also conserve limited resources, building materials and energy, and reduce carbon emissions. I want my neighbors to live with flexibility in the rules about sanitary and electrical connections. The current BDS guidelines for these services are a good starting point. Please don't take away the economic advantage of tiny homes and make them unaffordable. For a couple of weeks of every year, I also live in a tent. A number of my Cully neighbors live in tents year-round, not like me in the high mountains of Oregon and Washington, but on sidewalks and parking strips. I have never experienced homelessness, never doubted that I could have a place to sleep, safe, warm, and dry, never worried about where to find a bathroom or a place to throw my garbage. As I watched growing numbers of my neighbors living outdoors through a cold, wet winter, I've become more aware of my privileged life, privileges I enjoy through an accident of my birth in a middle-class family. Allowing faith-based and community organizations in Cully to host outdoor shelters as a matter of right will help my houseless neighbors move off the street to places with garbage and sanitary service and other help that they need to stay healthy. My thanks to you and the various bureaus for your work on this important project. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Next up, we have Johan Hunnison.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Commissioner, staff. Just wanted to reiterate a lot of the testimony that we've heard today. I specifically wanted to also emphasize Eli's invited testimony, the component about broadening this proposal to apply to more than just single family homes. In concert with the work that's been done with the residential infill project, I think it's really important that any proposal that we have here is forward looking and will continue to apply to the new types of housing that we hope will be built to alleviate the housing crisis. I also wanted to call out a program that's currently being piloted by the Portland Bureau of Environmental Services to pump out waste from RVs that currently cannot afford a hookup. I think this is a really great program. And I think it speaks to the need that exists today, and that some of the people who could benefit from the RV and tiny house provisions are the same people who are leveraging this program. So I would like to ask that you pay special attention to the cost component of the sewer hookup requirements, the cost component of any appeals or any conditional uses, because the same people who are benefiting from this free service may also want to have an RV housed on a property. And they have a pretty large gap between being able to pay for a sewer hookup and going from this current pilot program, which I think is doing great work. So I would encourage you to pay attention to both of those areas and attempt to make any improvements to bridge those gaps. And also, generally, I would like to strongly support all of the Portland Neighbors Welcome amendments. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Johan. Who's next, Kaylin?
Next up, we have Simon Boas, followed by Mac Cunningham and Douglas Klotz.
Good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Simon Boas, and I'm a resident of the King neighborhood. I spoke to you some weeks ago in support of the formal legalization of occupied tiny houses on wheels and RVs on residential property. I expressed my concerns over the added burden and cost that comes with the recommendations to require electrical posts and sewage connections for existing tiny houses and RVs. After hearing the most recent presentation from, I think it was the Water Bureau some weeks ago, I'm still very worried about the proposed requirements and that they would displace Portland residents from existing tiny houses and RVs and discourage residents from creating space for new dwellings of this sort. There are a number of alarming assumptions made in that presentation. Not all tiny houses are snuggled right up next to the main house on the property. Sometimes they're in the backyard where every extra foot of electrical cable that has to be laid, every extra foot of water disposal line that has to be dug and plumbed can bring hundreds of added dollars in cost. This adds up very quickly. The figures from the Water Bureau represent a best case scenario under ideal conditions that, unfortunately, does not describe the real costs many existing tiny house dwellers would face if they suddenly had to make dramatic changes to the utility setups in homes they've lived in for years now. That's why I support Portland Neighbors Welcome and their call to codify the city's existing guidelines for occupied tiny homes and RVs. The city has for years now provided literature on requirements and best practices for placing a tiny house on residential property. The pamphlet the city has published was extremely helpful when my wife and I set up our tiny house utilities. We, like many Portland residents, want to be good neighbors by following guidelines set by the city. The existing guidelines set by the city for tiny houses and RVs have proven to work well. They actively address things that our community wants to avoid, like illegal dumping, but they give residents flexibility to use alternative systems like water filtering, for example, for financial and environmental reasons. They also provide guidelines for safely installing power without the thousands of dollars needed to build a campground style post. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Simon.
Next up, we have Mac Cunningham.
Hello, commissioners and Mayor Wheeler. My name is Mac Cunningham, and I'm a graduate student in urban and regional planning at PSU and a proud member of Portland Neighbors Welcome. Thank you all for the opportunity to testify before you all here today. I would like to implore you all to approve the amendments you're considering here today. The first amendment to allow shelters on churches, faith-based organizations, and community organizations' properties will reduce the barriers these institutions face in trying to help our fellow Portlanders. It also aligns the Shelter to Housing Continuum Code with expanding opportunities for the Affordable Housing Code. The second amendment, which allows for flexibility for tiny homes on wheels and RVs, this legalizing these options on residential property, make sure that these important housing options, which come at a low barrier to cost, can be expanded in the future and supports those folks who are living in those housing types now. I ask you also to codify the current rules for from BDS for utilities and do not make them more restrictive. The current guidelines are working well, and to remove them would displace folks. Additionally, I would like the city to use the loan program to incentivize sewer hookups, but please do not pretend that it is a replacement for added flexibilities for those property owners. Lastly, as you, our city commissioners, have been working through the shelter to housing continuum, I've been reflecting on something that we were all taught when we were younger. For a moment, I would encourage everyone to please close your eyes and think back to what our second and third grade science teachers taught us. What were the three basic things that people need to survive? Food, water, and shelter. Housing is a human right and should not be viewed solely as a commodity or a wealth-building asset. Our city and our code should be encouraging more flexibility to allow for more shelter and housing types for unhoused neighbors. They deserve a warm place to sleep at night, just like the rest of us who are currently lucky enough to be housed. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mac.
Next up, we have Douglas Klotz.
Hello, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners. My name is Doug Klotz. I support the Shelter to Housing Project as well as the Portland Neighbors Welcome amendments. I support the conditional use requirement being eliminated for shelters on faith-based institution property. And as far as RVs and tiny houses, we need more the flexibility for utility hookup requirements that are in place now. I know of a case where a property owner got an estimate for how much it was to run a sewer pipe from the front of the house to the backyard where the tiny house was going to sit, which seems like a typical case. It would, but the sewer pipe comes in the front yard. You have to dig down 8 feet, make a Y, run around, run down the side of the house, run into the backyard. The estimate for that was $10,000. So, and that's a fairly simple case. It's a straight run. So alone or not, it's just way too much for some people to carry. And I'm glad to hear there's a composting toilet option. I hope that the appeal costs can be waived or somehow made smaller. It annoys me though to find that the gray water still has to have a sewer hookup. I've heard of a city program where they encourage people to dump the gray water from their washing machines and into the yard. You use a certain type of biodegradable soap and it's okay. So why not? Why would this not always also be good for water from a shower or from dishwashing in your kitchen sink? It seems to me that we should be able to work out something to handle the gray water along with the composting toilet, so we don't have to have a hookup just for the gray water. And we need to legalize this, the flexibility that we have now, and do whatever we can to encourage the cheaper options like the composting toilet and dilution or other things to handle gray water without having to have an expensive sewer hook that you could just as well hook the toilet to. So I hope you can do all of that, and thank you for considering us.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here, Douglas. Next.
Next up, we have Sean Green, followed by Aisha Linnell and Aaron Brown.
Thank you. My name is Sean Green. I'm chair of the Northeast Coalition of Neighborhoods and with PDX Shelter Forum and Shelter Now. I'm here today in support of increasing flexibility to help our community. I support removing the conditional use requirement for shelters on institutional sites, which include faith-based organizations, to support our unhoused neighbors. I also support allowing vehicle dwellings on private property, as advocated by Portland Neighbors Welcome. I support the collaboration within our community to help solve the challenges we face. Someone who's part of 2 organizations that center and prioritize the voices and needs of our unhoused neighbors, I've had the opportunity to get to know many folks who are being supported by alternative housing and shelter, but I meet many more who are asking for access to those options. The recent increase in clearing of camps are frustrating, not only for the trauma it is causing our unhoused neighbors, but because I also personally know advocates in our community who are ready and prepared to help and support and collaborate to support our unhoused neighbors. And barriers like conditional use permits and regulations and red tape on behalf of government are creating more trauma and perpetuating that trauma in our community. And it's time for us to come together as a community and to work together, the faith community, the business community, and the neighborhood advocates to support. And I know firsthand that there are so many people in our community. I'm inspired every day as I meet more and more of them who are ready to help be part of the solution. And I feel like we need to see a turning point in the types of things the privileged decision makers will allow to support the desires of our unhoused neighbors. And I think it's easy to say that there's certain living situations that one might not want to have, but if the voice is coming from the people who are in a terrible situation and looking for ways to step out of it, to get stability in their life, let's work together to provide that. I thank you very much. And thank you for all. This is a very complex policy area, and I know all of you on council are working very hard to help improve the conditions for our community.
Thank you, Sean.
Next up, we have Aisha Linnell.
Hi, my name's Isha Lino, and I want to thank you for working to adopt the shelter to housing continuum. I support the shelter to housing continuum and Portland Neighbors Welcome recommendations. And I'm specifically advocating for legalizing residential use of tiny houses and RVs on residential properties, and want to encourage you to codify the current BDS rules for utilities. I own a single family home and a tiny house, and I speak for many of the tiny house community whom are unable or unwilling to represent themselves in advocating for the increased flexibility and housing options that they require. I live very comfortably in my tiny house, and I rent out rooms in my single family home. This has allowed me to create stable housing in a single family home and a wonderful standard of living for 3 residents that are at risk of displacement, while freeing up additional housing stock around the city. It's been really wonderful. I've been able to provide undermarket housing and create a thriving community and support network that functions kind of like a family. Together, we've been able to weather the economic and social challenges exacerbated by an elitist federal administration, the social unrest, and COVID-19. I've also personally benefited by receiving needed support from my housing community while going through a divorce. And I've been able to reduce my cost of living, enabling me to maintain ownership of my property and provide housing for myself and those that I care deeply for. To increase flexible housing options and avoid further criminalization and displacement of those in need of housing, I request that you adopt Portland Neighbors Welcome recommendations. Please legalize RVs and tiny houses on wheels on residential properties and codify the current BDS rules for utilities and not make them more restrictive. Thank you so much for your great work on this project.
Thank you, Sean. Who's next, Keelan?
Next up, we have Aaron Brown.
Good afternoon. Can folks hear me?
Yes, Aaron, loud and clear.
Fantastic. Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners, my name is Aaron Brown. I live in the St. John's neighborhood of North Portland. I'm here to testify in support of the Portland Neighbors Welcome position in support of the shelter to housing continuum. I live near Pier Park, and one of the first times I walked to the park, I noticed that the street adjacent to the green space was lined with signs saying that recreational vehicles were not allowed to park there. It took me a few minutes for it to dawn on me that this must have originally been the city's response to trying to crack down on folks living in RVs near the park. It was a grim reminder to me that the city has all sorts of little tips and tricks it uses to make life that much more difficult for our unhoused or barely housed neighbors, to keep them out of sight, on the margins, those who are suffering from truly Dickensian economic circumstances exasperated by the pandemic and increasingly uncertain weather and economy. I'm disgusted by the increased hostility from Portland neighbors who aren't particularly neighborly to all those living in their community. But looking after those signs, imagining my surprise a few weeks later, I saw multiple blocks of the park roped off, reserved for the filming of a television commercial for a multinational conglomerate apparel company. They were filming a commercial in the park, and multiple blocks of the street were lined with RVs. These were some of the nicest RVs I've ever seen. I'm not an RV connoisseur, but they were full of fancy technology, makeup artists, and well-dressed, fit-looking athletes and models who looked especially well-dressed and fit compared to me, sporting the particularly shaggy and unkempt pandemic chic look. To be clear, I'm not opposed to the film industry or apparel companies thriving here in Portland. I'm grateful to see local TV companies filming in my neighborhood, creating jobs for my friends in creative fields. But the juxtaposition of these fancy RVs parked right next to signs saying no RV parking allowed hit a little too close to home. It seems that currently Portland has plenty of space and policies to welcome wealthy private businesses, and that we need substantial policy changes and investments to similarly make space for the most vulnerable among us, surviving our overlapping housing and public health crises. Passing the shelter to housing continuum with the RV amendments proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome is a great way to affirm our values that we as Portlanders, in fact, welcome all of our neighbors, including those experiencing housing precarity. Please pass the included amendments proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome for greater shelter flexibility. I hope you'll extend the housing state of emergency as well. And in the words of that aforementioned multinational conglomerate apparel company, let's just do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And for the record, we did extend the housing emergency. I think that was last week, right, Commissioner Mapp? All right, next, Keelan.
Next up, we have Atul Acharya, Fiona Burgess, and Emma Dixon.
Hi, this is Athul Acharya. Can everyone hear me? Hi, I am here to testify in favor of the Portland Neighbors Welcome amendments that have been proposed. And I'm going to echo what a lot of people have been saying already, so I'll keep it mercifully brief. I think the city should allow community organizations to host shelters on their property by right, because the city should make it easier for community organizations to help support struggling people. It's not just the right thing to do, it'll conserve city resources as well. I also think the city should allow tiny houses and wheels and RVs to exist with the safe and sanitary guidelines from the Bureau of Development Services, not the narrower one-size-fits-all requirements that would impose prohibitive new costs on residents that will displace some existing residents and prevent others from being housed at all. I do support the Water Bureau's proposed loan program, but as an incentive in addition to existing guidelines and their flexibility. Please pass the proposed amendments and sheltered housing continuum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Fiona Burgess.
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Yes, Fiona.
Hello. My name is Fiona Burgess. I'm a resident of Southwest Portland. I'm here to advocate for Portland Neighbors Welcome's proposed amendments for this shelter to housing continuum proposal. In particular, I am concerned that the city's proposals for utility restrictions on tiny homes on wheels and RVs on residential property would present unnecessary barriers. The current BDS guidelines already provide multiple safe and reliable options for utility configurations, and requiring sewer connections or electrical posts would present a needless cost to people who are already working with limited resources. On a personal note, beyond the big name nonprofits and the handful of advocacy groups that our city consults with at meetings like this, there are several small informal groups of concerned Portlanders doing all they can to support their unhoused neighbors using our own money, time, and resources. And while none of us have any intention of stopping this support anytime soon, I want to express my frustration that the city, working with even more resources taken from our tax dollars, seems to be making a point of making our efforts more difficult at every turn by insisting on this kind of red tape. I'm aware of my own privilege when I say this. As Marisa said, very few of the people speaking here today are going to be directly impacted by these regulations. And even the most dedicated advocates cannot really provide a full picture of the conditions on the ground for people experiencing homelessness at this exact date and time. I certainly can't. But it's not hard for me to look at these existing plans and see which priorities are being put first. Even when making accommodations to people without a traditional housing, the city sees an opportunity for generating revenue by placing these restrictions. The Water Bureau's proposed loan program for sewer installation costs may be a good option for those who wish to get sewer hookups, but that is not the same as offering accessible options for those at risk of displacement. Consider how many housing insecure people are in their position because they're already saddled with stifling debt. I urge you to keep all existing options open and look into more options for shelters on private property, including the proposed hosting rights for churches, faith-based organizations, and community organizations. Even if you haven't put it on the table today, I'll say it every time, stop the sweeps. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona.
Next up, we have Emma Dixon.
Hey, can everyone hear me?
Yes, Emma.
Great. My name is Emma Dixon. I'm a resident of Northwest Portland currently, and I'd like to voice support for Portland Neighbors Welcome's proposals regarding hosting shelters on faith and community-based organization property and preserving flexibility in utility hookups. I wanted to talk about, I think a lot has been said about the cost of permanent sewer hookups. I would also want to point out that it's not just the cost, but the hassle of any sort of development project can be a lot for a busy person who is working and just happens to be renting out some space in their yard to manage. Particularly, I think we talk a lot about the case of someone who maybe is looking to be a long-term tiny house landlord, but I think there are a lot of cases where maybe someone is hosting a friend or a relative who is living in an RV for, hopefully a year or two while saving up a deposit. So the expense and the hassle present obstacles. So to the extent that alternative solutions would require an appeals process, I'd want that process to be as streamlined, as inexpensive, and as well advertised and communicated as possible. I'd also like to question the necessity of limiting such dwellings to the backyard. My understanding is that RVs can't be parked in the front yard right now. And as someone who is trying to buy a house in the Portland area, I spend a lot of time looking at house advertisements. And I'm really struck by the number of homes that have much larger front yards than backyards, or in places like Lad's Addition, don't have backyards at all. So just excluding whole tracts of areas is going to leave out a lot of possible sites, as well as, the most obvious place to put a tiny house on wheels or an RV is a driveway, which tends to be in the front. So I'd like to urge some consideration of that flexibility as well. Thank you.
Emma.
Next up, we have Stephen Judkins, Michael Anderson, and Paul Souders.
Hi. I'm not quite in the weeds on all the specific policy details right now we're discussing, and I'd like to really thank everyone who is delving because they are important. But most importantly, we are truly in a short-term, immediate homeless crisis in Portland. I think everyone on all parts of the political spectrum would agree on that. Fundamentally, we need to make it quick, simple, and easy to address this in the most expedited, cheap, quick, and simple way possible. It's very important that we get people who are living rough on the streets housed as quickly as possible. Beyond that, I understand there are some criticisms to things about sewer hookups and faith-based organizations placing things on their property, but I see no chance that with some careful thought, we can't just make sure that any barriers we put up are quick and simple to do this. It's just going to reiterate again, for every month that someone lives on the street and isn't homed, the mental health, the physical health, the consequences of that are dire. And I think this damaging the fabric of our society and the city as well. It reduces trust. It makes people see each other not quite humid. We need to fix it. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you guys make the right choice.
Thank you, Stephen.
Next up, we have Michael Anderson.
Good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Michael Anderson. I'm a senior researcher at Sightline Institute. We're a regional sustainability think tank. I'm here in support of the Shelter to Housing Continuum proposal and the amendments backed by Portland Neighbors Welcome, the Interfaith Alliance, and PDX Shelter Forum. Sightline's belief is that cities are good for our society, or for our environment, for our economy, that everyone who wants to live in a city should get to live in a city. Like everyone else so far today, we believe every human being deserves stable, long-term housing. And this package includes some great things to lower the cost of true housing. It also does things that would help more people find safer places to sleep tonight. Those are different goals, and we support both. When I think specifically about RVs and shacks and other half measures that offer a bed but not a door but not a lock but not a toilet but not plumbing, I found it useful to think about a very different housing issue, that is front yards. 100 years ago, some Portlanders were of the belief that front yards are good, and I agree. Having a front yard is really nice. What Portland voters did then was not good. In much of the city, they made yards mandatory. They said, if you can't afford a yard, then you can't live in Eastmoreland or Laurelhurst or Hillsdale. When we think that something is good, be that an amenity like a yard or a human right like a place to poop, there's always a temptation to require it. But we can't achieve human rights with unfunded mandates on our poor neighbors. That's what we're talking about here. We will achieve human rights only by making sure everyone actually has them, which will take time, and we're in a crisis right now. Please do not let our shared desire for everyone to have a stable long-term home lead you to create unfunded mandates on Portlanders who cannot afford to meet them. Legalize the things that let people live, and let's also work together to make people's lives better. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael.
Next up, we have Paul Souders.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Paul.
Hello. Yes, thank
Yes.
you. My name is Paul Souders. I live in Southeast Portland. I strongly support the amendments proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome, including allowing faith-based organizations to host shelters by right and more flexible options for siting RVs and tiny houses. I provided testimony last month on St. Patrick's Day when I talked about a friend's father who was living in an illegally sited RV when he died of fungal pneumonia, which was probably related to his living situation. So this was an RV that had no utilities at all. Since that day, I realized I know at least 2 other people in my social circle, which is, I mean, you know, I'm a privileged person. It's dominated by comfortable middle class, mostly homeowners. Everybody's housed, but except for, I realized I know at least 2 people who live in RVs that are not legally sited or connected to city services. So it's interesting to think that, first of all, I had not considered these folks in unhoused or homeless. Got me to thinking that, as Eli noted, there are already Portlanders living in illegally sited RVs without utility connections. I'm looking at one right now. Sorry. We should find the least difficult means to bring these existing RVs into legal compliance. We should definitely not make it more difficult to bring RVs and tiny homes into compliance or to raise barriers to hosting RVs and tiny houses. I think we should do everything within our abilities to make it easier to let people live in the safest, most sanitary conditions they possibly can. We should make it easier, not harder, to legally site RVs and tiny houses. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Next up, we have David Benig, Anna Kemper, and Jake Antlis.
Thank you. I'm David Benig, and I appreciate that the council is considering these amendments. I think, first of all, the amendment to allow churches and community organizations to host shelters by right should be an easy choice here. These are people and institutions that are trying to help, and so far as possible, I would say the city shouldn't be putting obstacles in their way. I think that's true for tiny houses as well. I know at the beginning of this hearing, Dr. Zapata described this as a fun, wonky conversation, and I would respectfully, I think, disagree with that, in that for the people in Portland who currently live in tiny houses on wheels or who don't have homes, this is a really serious and urgent conversation. And there's a temptation here to ask, what kind of housing should we want to provide? But the reality we're dealing with here is that the city government doesn't have the capacity to provide housing for everyone who needs it. So what we're really talking about is not what to provide, but what to prohibit. And from that point of view, I'd be very wary of the council's current intention to make sanitary requirements more strict. We can say as a hypothetical that we want everyone to have full indoor plumbing, but the practical question here is, if someone's currently living in a tiny house with a composting toilet, do we want to kick them out on the street? I hope that council will broaden those restrictions. I would also echo what Henry Kramer said, that if alternative sanitation arrangements are handled by waivers, those waivers should be both free to applicants and the city should publicize that fact so this doesn't become a disincentive to people who want to help be part of the solution here. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Next up, we have Anna Kemper.
Good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Anna Kemper. I'm currently a renter in Northeast Portland in an area that was originally Cowlitz and Multnomah tribal land. Today I'm here on behalf of Sunrise Movement PDX. We're a youth climate justice organization working to stop climate change. And I'm also a board member of Portland Neighbors Welcome. I'm going to keep my comments today brief, as you've already heard from many folks with the same position as me. I fully support the amendment that allows faith or community-based organizations to host shelters on their properties. And the Second Amendment regarding rules for tiny homes and RVs should be as unrestrictive as possible. Many folks this afternoon have given thoughtful and humanizing testimony on these amendments with recommendations meant to protect our houseless neighbors. I wanted to offer my perspective as a young person who was born and raised in Portland. I'm 25 years old and I've been giving testimony at City Council for 2 years now. In 2019, we were 11 years away from the climate crisis tipping point. Today, we have less than 9. I'm terrified for my future, for future generations, and I want to live in a city that is proactive, not reactive on the climate crisis. We're already seeing the impacts. Those 2 weeks last September with wildfires at our doorsteps put the problem at hand into perspective for Portlanders, while our houseless neighbors face the brunt of the difficulties. Frontline communities around the world are already experiencing the severe and real impacts of the crisis. As ocean levels rise and as our planet continues to face climate-related disasters, we're going to be seeing an influx of climate refugees into our city. So I implore you to give our city the tools it needs to take care of our houseless neighbors with dignity today while preparing for the future. Pass shelter to housing, consider the recommendations on the amendments, and stop sweeping houseless encampments in Portland. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Anna.
Next up, we have Jake Antlis.
Hey there, my name is Jake Antles, and I'm getting over a preschool-induced cold, sorry, and just would like to support the adoption of the current BDS guidelines for mobile dwellings and residential zones. I personally lived in a tiny house community in which there were 4 tiny houses. I lived there for 5 years. 2 of those years were in a house that's 160 square feet with my partner. In the community we lived in, we had strict rules about what could go into the carefully considered French drains that we set up. And we used the existing ground-bound home for all of our sewer needs. Under the current proposal, that wouldn't be allowed because the first option for mobile dwellings without indoor plumbing, however, every tiny house I've ever seen has indoor plumbing, and most, if not, and many, if not most, of RVs would have water and indoor plumbing because it's a basic human dignity to have a place to wash your hands and prep some basic food. So that's not really an option. There should be an option for gray water systems. I'd also like to point out that I've seen multiple occupied mobile dwellings in front yards in Portland. In my neighborhood of Coley, I know of a tiny house in a front yard that's been there for 7 years. And apparently neighbors are happy with it. So to create a rule based on the assumption that we're sort of protecting our community from being annoyed at seeing residences in front yards is I'm not sure if it's super helpful. There's currently rules about illegally dumping sewage onto the earth. So I don't see why we should mandate a sewer connection. We should adopt the BDS guidelines and maintain the flexibility for folks. The rent has never gone up in that community. It's still $250 after 7 years. That is an incredible opportunity to scale across the entire city of Portland. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake.
Next up, we have Sarah Carolus, Megan Goss, and Jonathan Greenwood.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Carolus. I'm a resident of Northeast Portland. I'm a member of Central Lutheran Church and the Interfaith Alliance on Poverty. As a person of faith, I'm talking today about allowing faith-based institutions to host shelters on their property by right. However, I also strongly support the Portland Neighbors Welcome recommendation to reduce regulation of tiny houses on wheels and RVs. Last year's zoning changes removed conditional use barriers for faith groups to build affordable housing on their property. I call on you today to remove yet another conditional use barrier, this time for transitional shelters. It is a logical extension. Faith groups are generally not wealthy and can't afford to pay expensive conditional use reviews. It's just not in their budgets. Conditional use reviews eat up much time and energy when houseless could instead be off the streets in safe transitional shelter. Faith groups are mostly located in residential zones where the amendment would apply. Religious populations are declining and there are unused and partially empty faith parking lots and buildings. These are these are perfect sites for faith groups to live out their faith and help the houseless. Faith groups are a good resource and the city should not put limits and regulations on them. In order to end this devastating homeless crisis, the city needs to keep options open, and faith groups are a good option. I believe most of these arguments also hold true for community-based institutions. Please remove conditional use regulations that hinder all institutions' efforts to move the houseless off the streets. Thank you very much for your time and consideration today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Next up, we have Megan Goss.
Hello. Thank you, council members, for this opportunity to speak on the Shelter to Housing Continuum package. My name is Megan Goss. As a resident in the Foster Powell area, I strongly support the two amendments proposed by Portland Neighbors Welcome. Our neighborhood includes many houseless community members, and the current codes do not allow opportunity for basic human needs, such as stable shelter, to be met. The camp near me deals with loud and unsafe drag racing, harassment, lack of support for mentally ill within the community, the constant threat of displacement, and aggressive law enforcement tactics. Community organizations who already work to provide assistance for those in need should be given all the tools possible to offer stability and safety to the houseless population, including the ability to provide shelter on their property. Please remove the obstacles that prevent vulnerable community from finding hope. I am also invested in the amendment dealing with trailers and tiny homes on private property. At the beginning of the pandemic, my brother faced a life transition and was displaced in the process. As an intern, working to develop software engineering skills, he could not afford an apartment in Portland. He was able to pull together enough money to buy a trailer and currently lives at the back of our house. Every couple of weeks, he gets the holding tank pumped, and we had an outside outlet installed with a separate breaker that provides electricity just for his trailer. We actually believed that this was all legal, but I just became aware that the guidelines from the city are not codified, and so this arrangement isn't stable. Additionally, I learned that stricter guidelines will be enforced, including the need for a campsite-style electrical pole and a sewage connection. This would make our setup even more tenuous and would make it difficult to provide temporary housing for my brother who needs it. I'd ask that both of these amendments be seriously considered. Please codify current guidelines and allow for maximum flexibility for residents like my brother. Additionally, please remove the obstacles that prevent vulnerable communities from finding hope and allow additional safe shelter options such as faith-based or community group property stays. Finally, we have a houseless crisis in Portland. This is not a time to focus on protecting the many privileges of the housed. Please consider refocusing rhetoric that ignores those who are in need and only considers the objections of homeowners as valid. Thank you for letting me talk.
Of course. Thank you, Megan.
Next up, we have Jonathan Greenwood.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Jonathan.
Okay. My name is Jonathan Greenwood. Hello, Mayor and Council. First, I'd like to say I support Portland Neighbors Welcome recommended amendment for shelters on churches, faith-based organizations, and community organizations. We should make it easy for these organizations to help our most needy people. This will also align Shelter to Housing Continuum Code with expanding opportunities for affordable housing code. Council has already recognized the special role community-based institutions have in supporting needy people. Applying it to Shelter to Housing Continuum Code will simply extend the concession to those who are even more vulnerable. Second, I also support Portland Neighbors Welcome on flexibility for tiny houses on wheels and RVs on residential property. We should legalize tiny houses on wheels and RVs on residential property. This includes not making rules for utilities more restrictive. To do so would displace people. There are options for sanitation that don't require expensive changes to properties such as waste pumping, gray water dilution systems, and hermetic sealing or dehydrating toilet systems. Additionally, the current rules for electricity are safe and sufficient. On the whole, the loan program proposed for sewer hookups may work on paper, but it sacrifices flexibility and may transfer costs to tenants living in tiny houses on wheels or RVs. This increases the risk of displacement. And I'd like to close by saying over the last 10 years, as someone with bipolar disorder, I've lived in precarious situations multiple times, and I currently live with a partner and I don't pay rent. So I have extreme empathy for people that are living in precarious situations and people that are homeless. Please pass these amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Keelan, we have 3 more remaining, correct?
Let me see here really quick. We have 7 more.
Oh, all good.
The next 3 are Ray Ricken, Lynn Smouse Lopez, and Maria Abad.
Hello, thank you, Mayor Wheeler and City Commissioners for your thoughtful consideration of the amendments on the Shelter to Housing Continuum. I am Ray Richen, a member of the Interfaith Alliance on Poverty and of Rose City Park Presbyterian Church. I would like to say, in regard to Dr. Zapata's concerns, that I and members of my congregation were involved in helping to build tiny homes in the Central Nazarene Church. We certainly could hear from those residents of those villages and others like them. And in the case of the Central Nazarene Church, those were the residents were the people who supervised us volunteers as we helped to build. Hers is a good consideration. Getting testimony may have to include visits, but will reveal how and how well these villages can work. Tiny homes are one of many viable alternatives to shelters and should be available at the lowest possible cost. I'm also here today to urge you to advocate for eliminating the conditional use permit process when a faith-based or other institution wants to set up a transitional shelter, either on their property or inside their facility. Reducing the cost of conditional use review will make it possible for faith properties in Portland to provide transitional housing alternatives without the nearly $22,000 in fees. The reduced time delays will also allow us to offer transitional housing to more people more quickly. It's clear that living in tents hidden in the bushes does not allow people to plan for solving financial problems, though many have jobs. And living in that way is devastating for the numerous families who have fallen into houselessness. We need to offer stability, community, and transitional villages that support financially and emotionally traumatized families and individuals, allowing them to transition successfully to the wonderful low-income apartments that you're working to provide over the next 3 years. Please vote for the amendment that allows this kind of effective and efficient planning and use of space now as a big step in solving our housing crisis. Make it possible today for people to get ready to use the stability of the apartments of Portland's future. Thank you.
Ray.
Next up, we have Lynn Smouse Lopez.
And I had unmuted myself, but apparently it didn't count and I had to unmute again. Sorry. I am the pastor of Ainsworth United Church of Christ, and it's great to be able to see Dan. And I am blessed to know 2 of you personally, and I know that you have the heart for the city. I know you all are doing this because you care for the city. Well, so do I, and so does our church. We are members of the Interfaith Alliance on Poverty and part of the Levin Land and Housing Coalition. At Ainsworth, we also host the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon HIV Day Center. So we see the issues and challenges of houselessness firsthand. And we are striving as a congregation to discern the ways that we are called to address this challenge. I'm here to support the Shelter to Housing Continuum and to advocate for eliminating the conditional use permit process when a faith-based or other institution wants to set up transitional shelter, either on their property or in their facility. We know that going through the conditional use review, and you've heard the testimonies, it costs a lot. It's a barrier that's huge for a lot of faith communities. This amendment would help significantly in reducing costs, cutting that bureaucratic red tape that I know you all want to do. You want to just get rid of it, right? So we call on you for that. Make this process more easier and more affordable so we can help more people, because we want to do that. We want to help and we can't do it alone. So thank you for letting us work to provide more units of housing for people. Thanks.
As always, it's great to hear your voice, Pastor Lynn. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Maria Abad. Maria, are you able to unmute?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go. Thank you. Good afternoon, City Commissioners. My name is Maria Abad, and I am the head of the early childhood at the International School, an independent preschool and elementary school. I am in my 26 years at this school. Our mission is to foster global citizen. We offer an international baccalaureate approach and full immersion programs in Mandarin, Spanish, and Japanese. Almost half of our students identified as either minority or mixed race, most being of Asian or Hispanic ethnicity. The majority of our faculty and staff are native Chinese, Japanese, or Spanish speaker. For 30 years, our school has proudly operated in the downtown Portland. Our current enrollment is approximately 350 preschoolers and elementary school students aged 3 to 11. They are on campus in person full-time 5 days a week. Our school is bordered on the 3 sides by city-owned open fields. While we embrace our location within downtown Portland, in the past several years, the situation at the surrounding fields have become increasingly hazardous and attainable. Here are some examples. In October, we picked 135 needles in one day. We currently are picking up 45-gallon trash can of garbage every day. Numerous individuals have been found to be either naked, partially naked, or unconscious in plain sight of our staff and young students. People regularly defecate, urinate in plain view of our classrooms. Individuals openly possessing, dealing, and using drugs in very close proximity to our campus. Our exterior plumbing is often cut water to get the irrigation pipes. Due to the state discrimination and drug possession, there is little guidance about enforcement of drug use and the near school zones. This, combined with the cancellation of the school resort office program, has left us feeling very vulnerable in terms of keeping our students safe. We, as a school, commend you for the efforts to serve, shelter, and assist Portlanders who have experienced houselessness. The Shelter to Housing Continuum project is a significant step toward expanding support and sheltering options. However, on behalf of the safety and well-being of Portland school children, we request that a 300-yard boundary zone be established around all schools that prevent city-owned or leased land from being used for encampment or designated as short-term or outdoor shelters. We feel that a boundary zone around schools is the only way to reasonably balance the needs of the city houseless population with those of our school children. Our school believes that global citizens begin at home. We desire to be good partners and neighbors with the city and share your vision for a Portland that supports long-term sustainability and foster well-being and happiness for all of its residents. Muchas gracias. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maria.
Next up, we have Sean Sweat.
Hello there. Thank you. I mean, at this point, after so many speakers, I don't think there's much new I could probably add. So let me just say that I support these amendments. These amendments that add flexibility and reduce bureaucratic hurdles for the Portlanders that most need our help. And just to add to that, I'd much rather see things allowed by right rather than requiring waivers and which complicate and slow down the process. And finally, just to kind of respond to that last idea about the 300-yard exclusion around schools or any sort of size exclusion around schools, that's especially in denser areas, that seems extremely problematic because that could just take most things off the table. So I'm not sure I would get behind that. But just generally speaking, I just want to really appreciate all the work the council and staff have put into this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Next up, we have Nick Burry. Michael Stein, and Reverend Chris De La Cruz.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yes, Nick.
Great. Good afternoon. My name is Nick Burry. I'm also an organizer with Sunrise PDX. And thanks to all the commissioners and everyone involved for all the work that's been done on this so far. I'll keep my comments short. A lot of what I was going to say has been said and before me and said better. But I think it's just important to remember that the ultimate goal of this project is to provide our unhoused community members access to safe, stable, and dignified forms of housing. To that end, we should be removing barriers to the realization of this essential right. That means allowing faith-based organizations to host shelters and housing units, and it means codifying the BDS rules on utilities to allow for more flexibility. We've got to remember the end goal here. If we keep allowing market logics to determine the fate of our most vulnerable community members, our housing crisis will only continue to worsen. This is unconscionable, especially as regular wildfires and other effects of the climate crisis impact those living in tents and other temporary shelters with increasing severity. We need to pass the shelter to housing continuum and adopt the amendments supported by Portland Neighbors Welcome. Thanks for your time, and please stop these absolutely grotesque sweeps. We're still going through a deadly pandemic. Don't forget that. Thank you.
Nick.
Next up, we have Michael Stein.
Hello, are you hearing me? Yes, good.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for listening so long today. It must be getting tiring, so thank you. I have heard so many kind people today, and the people of Portland are so kind that I'm afraid that what I'm going to say is going to sound very unkind. So maybe I've got you woken up a little bit just by saying that. I'm a former counselor. I've worked with seriously mentally ill people, helping them stay in the community. I myself have been rootless as a youth, so I know a little bit about kind of the environment. And here's my biggest fear. I am actually against this whole idea of having folks in the community on like parking lots, what have you, very well-intentioned, faith-based communities. It's all wonderful, but please think about Professor Zapata's idea of unintended consequences. I think it's stigmatizing for people to be camping on parking lots or on parking strips. It doesn't matter. And this isn't going to be a quick solution. This is going to be going on for a while. So I think what this whole S2HC plan is going to be perpetuating a problem. So I want to give you three words, three phrases, please, that I want you to remember. Dignity, peer empowerment, and timely safety. So, and here's where I would achieve those goals. Dignity. When people have a tent in the Northwest, when people have an RV, they go to a campground. And that's what's normal. That's what people do. So I urge folks for us to create campgrounds. Like I see huge parking lots owned by the Port of Portland along Marine Drive. Maybe other large spaces. I know we don't want to go into parks, but perhaps Delta Park could be a difference. Anyway, the general concept is having campgrounds. I would help people be empowered by being the camp hosts for those areas, and helping it be an orderly facility, following CDC guidelines, following sanitation guidelines. And I don't want to take too much of your time. I will just note that I'm the only person who's really spoken against it. And I was intrigued by this new policy spaces idea, which was a very kind way of saying a huge rat's nest. One of the people who spoke said we're going to be entering many new policy spaces. And then you heard all those people concerned about their little houses that are working so well. And we have all these new rules, and it's all because we're trying to shoehorn homeless people into our communities. I'm going to finish. they're going to be, the homeless are going to be with us long term. I think we need a long-term solution. I think people need to be in camps. I think they need help from their peers. I have more details I'll be happy to share with you at another time. But I think really the key point is for folks to be given dignity. If you're in a parking lot, I'm sorry, if you're next to a church, that's not dignity. You're going to be there 6 months, a year. Oh, and also the last thing, this is a crisis. We have to get everybody to these nice new camps where there'll be heating centers, where there'll be food, where there'll be adequate sanitation, where people won't be right next to each other. And I'm sorry, I'm way over my time, so I will finish. The greatest good for the greatest number. Think in terms of that, not what's going to be wonderful for a few people. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.
Next up, we have Reverend Chris De La Cruz.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Reverend Chris De La Cruz, a pastor with Westminster Presbyterian Church in Portland and a member of the Interfaith Alliance on Poverty, which, as you know, represents at least 14 faith congregations and more than 15 allies and partners in Portland. I support shelter to housing and both amendments today, and I'm here to specifically advocate for the amendment item to allow faith-based and other community organizations to hold shelters on their property, including, yes, parking lots. Look, we all know that we are in a housing crisis, but I am here today to remind folks that we are also in a moral crisis. And I'm sorry to get all preachy here. It's what happens when you get a pastor on a Zoom chat, right? But look, I mean, you know, this is a moral crisis, a moral emergency that more and more human beings, we're talking about human beings living on the street during a pandemic. And in my work as a pastor with houseless folks, over and over again, people tell me and the other pastors, just folks doing this work, they just want the same thing you all want. A roof over their head, a chance to make a life for themselves, and yes, dignity for themselves and their loved ones. And I am so proud and humbled at the many churches, temples, mosques, nonprofits, and other faith-based community institutions that said, yes, we can come together. Whatever our beliefs, agendas, we are God's people together who can use our property to help people. And yes, we as institutions by our nature are the ones who will be sensitive to our neighborhoods, who know we wouldn't set something up that didn't have the goodwill of our neighbors. So we're so dependent on our communities. And look, no one here wants people living on the streets. I know that. We know that we're so grateful for the support many of you have already given. And this amendment is a common sense solution that benefits everyone, right? You want community support in dealing with this crisis. We all want to use our property to do it without the huge hoops and costs that prevent us from doing it. No one wants to spend grandma's tithe money on $22,000 processing fees. We just want to help people. Why would we stop that? And to address the previous caller, since it directly addressed this, look, our church has hosted cars on our parking lot. No one, on the one hand, wants that. On the other hand, as we have given those folks laundry and our other pastors worked with them, and look, they'd rather have a place to live, but this solution of at least having something also gives them dignity. Let's not have the state take that away just because of some high-minded ideals about the kind of greatest amount for or whatever. Those folks deserve a place to live now. And so let's come together and show the public that we can do big things during a moral crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend De La Cruz.
That completes testimony, Commissioner Ray.
Oh, well, thank you, Keelan. I see the mayor is back. Are you back for good? The rest of the evening?
I am, but you're doing a great job. Why don't you go ahead and keep the gavel?
Okay. Well, first I just want to start by thanking we heard from 31 Portlanders today, and I think the last people who testified said it best. And we heard a lot of kindness, a lot of heart, a lot of willingness, and I know I can speak hopefully for my colleagues that we benefited from listening to all 31 of you. And so with that, let's go ahead and move into, at this point, we'll be moving into a conversation about the two issues. How about if we start with the shelters at institutional sites? Does that work for everyone? Okay. So do we have staff that want to give any, you're here for answering our questions, correct, Eric? All right.
Yes, Commissioner, I'm happy to answer questions, or I can call on the other staff you heard from earlier.
Great, thanks for being here. All right, so let's go ahead and start with conversations about the shelters at institutional sites. And we heard some great testimony on that today. Any questions or comments from my colleagues? Yes, Mayor Weaver.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryan. So I support this. As almost everybody who testified today said, the number of people living outside really reflects the severity of the challenge we're facing around homelessness and the incredible demands we're seeing in our community for both safety and shelter. And I'm very appreciative that we've heard from various institutions, particularly but not exclusively the faith-based institution. They want to be part of the solution. I appreciate their willingness to be part of the solution, and I welcome their support. And the 2.2 amendment, I think, removes some of the barriers that they themselves have described as being potentially standing in the way of that support. So, I am persuaded that allowing shelters without a conditional use up to 20 beds on institutional sites and single dwelling zones is appropriate. And while nothing we're discussing today is a perfect solution, I think this moves us considerably in the right direction towards strengthening our partnerships, particularly with faith-based institutions.
Thank you, Mayor. Commissioner Rubio. You're muted.
Thank you. I just want to echo those comments. I'm fully supportive of shelters at institutional sites. I'm excited to and ready to support this moving into amendment when the time comes. And just want to say, and we heard tremendous testimony from numerous people expressing, that this particular piece was right on target, and this is what we should be doing. And this allows multiple avenues for flexibility and in the spirit of what we're trying to do. So very, very excited to see this moving forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. Commissioner Matz.
And like my colleagues, I'm very supportive of 2.2, the proposal to allow shelters without conditional use up to 20 beds on institutional sites and single dwelling zones. I particularly want to thank the members of the faith community who came out tonight to talk about their eagerness to see this proposal pass. And I also appreciate the other voices that we heard from the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Matz. I will just weigh in and say I concur with what everyone's been commenting on. There was one testimony that said you're seeing people of faith, you're seeing some community organizing, that organizations that don't always agree on issues. You're just seeing a lot of different sectors of the political spectrum, the community spectrum that are coming together to say yes. And to have the communities of faith step up with enthusiasm. There was some great enthusiastic testimony. Things are looking good right now. It's a great day to have hope as we move this forward. Just a reminder to everyone that we are waiting till after 5 o'clock for the public record to close before we move motions, amendments. We will continue to have dialogue. And any more comments or questions about the institution's sites? And if not, we can go ahead and move into some conversations about the RV and tiny homes on wheels. And why don't we open up the floor for that? If we're hearing no more on the institutional, is that true? Okay. So the floor is now open for comments and questions about RVs, tiny homes on wheels. Yes, Mayor Weaver.
Well, I don't have any further questions. I think people raised a number of legitimate concerns. Again, I want to acknowledge that RVs and tiny homes on wheels on private property are definitely not the panacea to solving homelessness, but I do believe they can play an important role in addressing our need for middle housing. That's been a real struggle for this community and for the city in particular. And I believe that what staff has provided gives clarity to the rules. And I appreciate the research that staff had done, particularly with regard to the questions of the hookups and the alternatives to the hookups. And I appreciate the Planning and Sustainability Commission's thoughtful discussion that they had, which they related part of here today about the height. That had been a concern that a number of people have raised. And I think they made a compelling case that we allow outright other alternatives that impinge on neighbors to an even greater degree. So again, I support the staff work on this. I think it's the right direction for us to go. It creates flexible housing that is safe, it's sanitary, it meets environmental standards, and really puts us on a path towards supporting more flexible alternatives in the community. I'm mindful of what some of the testifiers said about people currently living in those situations and our desire not to put them back on the street. That would certainly not be my desire. And I appreciate the Bureau's saying that they will have flexibility as they transfer into a new environment. I think that's critically important. I think we should have a soft touch rather than a heavy hand on this, because the goal really is to help vulnerable populations, not hurt them. So I would encourage us to continue to move forward with that perspective in mind.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler. Commissioner Rubio.
I just want to say that I'm so appreciative of hearing from all of the testifiers. I learned something every single time. And the words of Professor Zapata are in my head. And I'm reminded that first we need to be careful about mistaking any shelter option as a substitute for true housing justice. And our work today and this policy doesn't really absolve us of that big work ahead on that front that is moving as we speak by so many advocates and dedicated housing providers. That said, I do believe that keeping this as an important option to avoid displacement of those already living in tiny homes and RVs is vital and necessary, and particularly in this crisis. And I'm very interested in learning more about how the city can programmatically develop low-cost alternatives and removals of barriers. I know there's been a lot of deliberation and conversations among all of our teams, and I trust that my colleagues who've done extensive work to look at this piece of the policy together with their bureaus also have these concerns in mind as they implement this policy, should it pass. So we need to be mindful of looking at all policies intended to expand opportunities, but also assess their potential unintended financial impacts and hardships at the same time. So I'll be watching this very closely, and I'll stand ready to work with my colleagues to further refine should we feel the need to do so.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. Commissioner Maps.
And I'd like to express my gratitude to everyone who testified on this aspect of the proposal before us today. I think this RVs and tiny houses on wheels are an interesting space. I think Professor Zapata pointed out that we're still learning very much how this new approach to housing works. I think, like my colleagues, I don't view this as being the solution to our houselessness problem, but I do think that it is an important addition to our housing options. I also, as the commissioner in charge of environmental services, there is something I want to push back on. I feel like this debate has been framed as the sewer hookup thing. I feel like has been framed as a zero-sum game between affordable housing and environmental protection. Part of our mission over at Environmental Services is to protect our rivers and our open spaces. We have done work that I'm incredibly proud of in terms of working with this community to find options that are win-wins. So many of you have probably heard of our special program to clean out black water from RVs that are on the streets. And I'm exceptionally proud of the loan program that we've created to help people hook up their tiny houses to sewer systems. I realize there's more work that can and needs to be done here, and I look forward to working with the community and BDS and environmental services to find solutions that are win-wins for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Mapps. I really appreciate the testimony, particularly on the points that all my colleagues are addressing right now. We want to continue to be nimble. We want to implement this with urgency. And, you know, it's complex in terms of the many bureaus that interface. And so we just need to have an in-depth conversation and remove fees that, you know, include all the bureaus. So I will, as a commissioner that oversees BDS, but this is multi-bureaus, we'll make sure that we tackle this quickly as we need to keep moving this forward. And so we've heard you, and there's consensus that we want to make this urgent amongst our colleagues. So we will. So I just wanted to mention that because there was some great testimony about ensuring that we don't add more red tape, but that we figure out how to make this seamless, and we're on it. So yeah, any other feedback or any other questions before we'll probably go into a recess and come back at 5:10. Is that correct, Mayor? Yeah. So we'll go ahead, unless there's any further discussion, we will go ahead and the record will remain open until 5 p.m. and we will reconvene at 5:10 to discuss these amendments, potential amendments. And with that, are you all ready to adjourn for now, for recess? All right. All right.
I'd just like to add one thing, if I may. I just want to compliment Commissioner Ryan on being such a good steward to this meeting today. You did a great job.
Oh.
Agreed. Absolutely. Thanks.
The staging's really been rough, so I appreciate that. Yeah.
I can't tell it all. You look great.
If you saw what's in my office, right? Anyway, we'll see you all at 5:10.
Thank you.
Go get some fresh air. All right. everyone back? Let's see. Okay, Mayor Wheeler. There you are. Okay, welcome back, colleagues. We're here to consider potential amendments to agenda items 250 and 251. At this point, I would entertain motions pertaining to the institutional sites or RV tiny homes on wheels. I think Commissioner Rubio, no?
I move to adopt Amendment 2.2 from March 31st, 2021 memo pertaining to institutional sites.
Second.
Great. Okay, there's a motion on the table. We have a second from, was that Mayor Wheeler? Okay. Clerk, please call the roll.
Ryan,
Yes, I am just all about options, and we've made a lot of progress over the last, what feels like a while, the last month in particular, to move this forward. And I've enjoyed the discussion. The testimony has been awesome, and I am looking forward to moving forward. I vote aye.
Maps,
I want to thank the staff who's just worked so hard on this measure. Your professionalism and skill is really on display here today. I also want to send out my gratitude to the dozens of Portlanders who showed up to testify or send us emails about these proposals. Your input makes the ordinance before us today even better. And finally, I want to thank the many faith institutions who urged us to adopt this ordinance so that we can work together to shelter our most vulnerable neighbors. And it is for those reasons that today I am delighted to vote aye.
Rubio.
I also want to really thank BPS staff who worked so hard on this, as well as other Bureau staff, and also the community that's advocated for all the different parts of this policy. I believe that the amendment in front of us will make this policy stronger and allow much more flexibility in finding resources to shelter our community. I want to thank Portland Neighbors Welcome, Sunrise PDX, and many community members that have consistently testified on this matter, and for not only bringing this particular amendment forward for discussion, but being willing to roll up your sleeves and help us do so. These initiatives are better when they're co-led with community, and I'm eager to see this move forward. I vote aye.
Wheeler.
I share in my colleagues' support for 2.2. It's good to remember that this conversation actually got its start when we were approached by faith communities, and they asked us for the flexibility they needed in order to be good partners with us to be able to address a vulnerable population. So they approached this very much from a values perspective, and they asked us to approach it from a pragmatic perspective to help them to be able to do what they wanted to do, consistent with what they saw as being their social mission in our community. And so I'm really glad that we were able to come to this resolution. It provides the flexibility that our faith partners need and other institutional partners. This definitely moves the ball in the right direction. I'm very happy to support it. I vote aye. Oh, and the amendment is...
the amendment passes, yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, colleagues. I need some legal. Do we have another amendment, correct? Or
Eric, if I'm reading the packet correct, the next one's actually not an amendment, right?
No, I think that the next steps then would be if the amendment passes, that concludes our business today, correct?
Yeah, so
just walk us through the next steps, and so take it away, Lauren.
Okay, so just as a reminder, the record is closed. It's my understanding, Eric, feel free to jump in, but I think council's planning on coming back April 28th to adopt the amended findings and any amended code commentary. That'll be sort of the penultimate step. Then there'll be one more final vote, but the findings will come back to reflect all of the changes you've made, and the record will remain closed until then. Anything I missed, Eric?
No, that's correct. And Commissioner Ryan, to your point earlier, the there was no amendment on the table yet for the RV and tiny house topic unless you were compelled to add one today.
No, hearing none. So thank you for the update, Lauren. That was very helpful. That was a really productive discussion today, and I just want to thank Lauren. I want to also thank our colleagues. And with that, it's time to go join a beautiful beautiful spring evening. And this meeting's adjourned.